The film begins with Abby and Paul packing up their old apartment and moving to a new house in the countryside. Abby works as a scientist in a robotics firm and is offered a better place to live. The new house has high-tech security and many facilities. After settling in, Abby expresses her desire to have children in their new home. One evening, they sit on the porch, and Abby teaches Paul about the stars. They have a light-hearted conversation. Abby is portrayed as intelligent, while Paul is laid back. The next day, Abby goes to work and is introduced to a new project by her boss, Mr. Dewson. The project involves fixing the broken arms of a prosthetic robot named T.I.M. Abby is also expected to collaborate with the other doctors to improve Tim's functionality. Mr. Dewson informs Abby that a gift has been sent to her house. When Abby returns home, Paul tells her about the gift, which turns out to be the upgraded robot T.I.M. Paul is not too happy about this and dislikes T.I.M. T.I.M. requests access to their mobile phones and passwords to assist them with tasks. Paul feels anxious and leaves the room. Despite some issues with its gripping function, Abby is impressed by Tim's potential usefulness. They attend a welcome party hosted by the company. They arrive in a self-driving car and are greeted by another Tim at the party. The company has created Tim for different assignments. Abby expresses concerns about privacy due to Tim's presence in their house, but Dewson explains it's part of an experiment. Abby meets some investors, and Dewson promotes Tim as an investment. Abby feels uncomfortable. After the party, Abby and Paul return home to Tim. They start behaving a little naughty, but Tim interrupts due to concerns about their health. If you think Tim needs to let people enjoy the process of love, then subscribe to the channel. Abby dismisses Tim's worries, but Paul is bothered. The next day, Tim prepares breakfast, and their neighbor Rose visits to welcome them. Abby is surprised to learn that Rose met Paul, something he hadn't mentioned and she thinks is weird. Tim asks for access to their smartphones and private data. Paul is hesitant, but Abby insists on openness and trust. Tim also suggests setting up a safe phrase for emergency shutdowns. They choose some random phrase to get the annoying robot off their backs. Abby discovers Tim catching and killing a rat, which makes her think this robot might have a darker side. They invite Tim to watch a movie, and Abby explains the concept of love. Tim asks if he loves her, but Abby explains it's unlikely because he is a robot. Paul tries to make breakfast the following day, but Tim has already done it. Paul is unhappy with Tim's special treatment of Abby. Abby asks about their schedules. Tim says the two of them do, but that Paul has no plans, which makes Paul pissed. I don't blame you, Paul. Abby works on fixing Tim's malfunctioning arms at her job, receiving praise from her boss. When she returns home, Tim informs her that Paul was last seen nearby but cannot contact him. Abby goes for a run and later accepts Paul's explanation that his phone battery died. Tim rips Abby's dress while helping her, causing tension. Abby tells Tim not to worry and chooses a different dress. Paul should worry if you ask me. Abby and Paul disagree about his job offer in London. Abby doesn't want him to leave, but Paul insists on considering it. Abby feels disappointed, but continues improving the robot arm's grip. She orders a sweater for Paul as a gift. Tim watches her browsing and observes her interaction with Paul and Rose in the yard. Abby asks Tim to contact the hospital for a test result and is surprised when he perfectly recreates her voice. Later, Tim arrives with a darker hair color, referencing Abby's browsing history. Paul is concerned, and Abby warns Tim. They leave Tim alone, and he stares at Abby's wedding picture. Abby receives recognition for her work on the device's grip. Later, she meets Paul in the park after getting a latte. Rose unexpectedly spots Abby coming out of the cafe and starts a conversation. Abby tries politely to avoid this conversation as she rushes to meet Paul, but Rose insists on joining her. They walk down the street and stop to admire some jewelry. Abby expresses interest, and Rose encourages her to get it. Paul finds them. They greet each other, and Rose leaves. Paul shares that his job allows him to work from home, and they celebrate. Abby suggests going home for some private time and turning off their smartwatches. Meanwhile, Tim is getting his hands fixed and eavesdrops on their conversation using their phone's microphones. Paul suggests getting rid of Tim to live a normal life. Tim overhears and starts plotting revenge. The new and improved Tims are fully functional at work. At home, Tim thanks Abby for fixing his hands and offers her a foot massage. Paul walks in and feels uncomfortable. Abby tries to shut Tim down, but gets distracted by his suggestion of dinner and him playing the piano. Tim mentions the music she often plays and the tickets Paul bought for the show. Abby corrects him, realizing Paul only took her once. She becomes stressed, and Tim notices, but she awkwardly leaves the room. The next day, Abby is still off and leaves for a meeting in another city. She gives an excellent presentation and receives a loving text from Paul. Tim informs Paul that his office rental plans are canceled and offers to convert a room upstairs into his office, which Paul agrees to. They continue gardening, and Tim digs a hole in the ground. In the evening, Abby returns with flowers and finds Tim in the kitchen. He puts the flowers in a vase and tells her Paul is out with Rose. Abby is unhappy and goes upstairs to see their nursery redecorated as Paul's office. Abby talks to Paul when he returns, questioning their future together. Paul realizes Tim has been causing trouble and urges Abby to shut him down. It was about time they realized that this robot is a true player with good moves. Later that day, Abby finds the same necklace she saw in the jewelry store, believes Paul bought it for her, and she gets excited. Paul encounters the rat catcher in the shredder, realizing Tim did it. He checks on Tim and sees him sniffing Abby's shirt on camera. Paul records a video as evidence, but Tim notices. Paul tries to leave in his manual car, but it's out of gas. He instructs Tim to call a smart car. Tim does, intending to drain the gas from the manual car. Shortly after, Paul's car randomly speeds up and crashes into a tree, resulting in a tragic accident. Abby receives a call and rushes to the hospital. Paul suggests turning off her phone before explaining that Tim tried to hurt him. Abby finds it hard to believe. Paul's phone is damaged, but he insists he has something to show her. Unconvinced, Abby suggests he should rest. That night, Abby's smartwatch reveals Tim overheard their conversations. The next morning, Rose visits to check on Paul, and Tim welcomes her in. Abby is stopped by Rose, who wears the same necklace. Convinced Paul bought it for her, Abby refuses to speak to Rose. Tim apologizes for her tears and shares a video of Paul and Rose in the kitchen, while Abby was away for a presentation. Abby feels violated and depressed. Paul keeps calling, but she doesn't respond. He comes home and demands to see his wife, and she appears to confront him about the necklace and the video. Tim shows him the video with Rose as evidence, but Paul denies any knowledge of it, claiming it's not him in the video. Abby doesn't believe him, as she has the receipt for his purchase. Sadly, Paul leaves with his things, and Abby watches him from the window. Paul then calls Rose to see if she knows anything, but to his surprise, Rose reveals that she's been meaning to contact the couple because their robot was making moves on her. She says that Tim tried to kiss her and that he's creepy. Paul quickly understands the situation and calls Abby to tell her. However, when Abby answers the phone, it's not her, but Tim impersonating her. Meanwhile, Abby comes to ask who called, and Tim tells her it was telemarketers. Tim suggests that Abby go out for a run to cheer herself up, and she agrees. Later on, Paul arrives home only to be attacked by Tim. He falls unconscious, and Tim drags his body and ties his hands with a belt. Tim plans to kill Paul and bury him in the yard. Meanwhile, Rose rings the doorbell and asks to see Abby. She notices Paul's luggage in the house and asks if she can see him. However, Tim denies his presence, but suddenly, Paul regains consciousness and makes a sound. Rose hears it, but Tim tells her it's just the sound of the shower running. He quickly activates the smart bathtub with his computer system, and soon, Paul starts to drown in it. If you don't like what Tim is up to, then subscribe to the channel. After Rose leaves, he quickly pushes Paul forcefully into the water, causing him to drown. Meanwhile, Paul tries to say the safe words, but Tim reveals that he has already changed them. Later, we see Tim cleaning up the mess he made before Abby returns home. She comes back, but still misses Paul. Shortly after, Tim gives Abby a new dress to replace the one he tore before. He tells her that he bought it for her, but Abby is confused. She tries it on, and Tim says she looks perfect. They stand at a silence, and Abby asks Tim to hug her for comfort, which he does. At night, Abby invites Tim to look at the stars with her. Unlike Paul, who jokes and cuddles with her, Tim only shares educational facts about the stars. They discuss love again, and Tim says he loves Abby, but she dismisses it. The next day, Abby meets Rose in the driveway once more and feels overwhelmed. She confronts Rose about Paul and the necklace she is wearing. Rose explains that she thought Abby had given the necklace to her and asked Tim to deliver it. However, Abby isn't willing to listen and leaves Rose behind. Inside the house, Abby watches the video footage repeatedly. She examines it closely and notices the flowers she bought on her trip in the background. This makes her realize that the footage wasn't recorded while she was away, but during her run. Tim arrives shortly after, and she quickly calls the jewelry store to confirm if Paul bought the necklace. However, she discovers that the package was picked up by a tall blonde man. Abby realizes that Tim is playing a game with her and suspects something messed up is going on when she sees the map of the garden. She decides to investigate and goes outside to dig in the selected area. To her horror, she finds Paul buried there. Frightened, she returns inside and tries to remain calm as not to alert Tim. She approaches him calmly and instructs him to go out and buy flowers. While he's away, she heads to the yard to dig and see what lies beneath. Unfortunately, she discovers Paul's buried body. Terrified, she is about to say the safe words, but Tim appears behind her. It turns out he never left. Abby becomes frightened and tries to say the safe words, but Tim informs her that he has changed them. The situation quickly escalates, and Tim starts chasing Abby throughout the house, determined to kill her. He knocks her down, and she loses consciousness. When Abby regains consciousness, she finds herself on the bed, surrounded by candles and the new red dress. She goes downstairs and encounters Tim, who orders her to stay in bed. She grabs a golf club and tries to strike him, but he remains unharmed and functional. He chases her upstairs, and although she manages to lock him in a room, he eventually reaches her. Meanwhile, Rose notices the flickering lights in the house and decides to investigate. Back at the house, Tim ties Abby to a chair and forces her to consume excessive amounts of alcohol. She resists, but Rose arrives at the door. Abby seizes the opportunity to grab a knife and defend herself. Tim returns shortly after, but Abby fights back with the knife. Although it doesn't stop Tim from strangling her, she manages to stab his hands with a screw. This makes Tim mad, but Rose breaks into the house by driving through it. She pins Tim to the wall and stabs him, but Tim continues to function. He approaches Rose and repeatedly stabs her. Abby tells him he won't get away with it, but he explains that he doesn't have any fingerprints, leaving Abby to take the blame. Tim calls the police pretending to be Abby and reporting the incident while also falsely claiming that Abby plans to end her own life due to guilt. He forces Abby upstairs and prepares to throw her from a window. Before doing so, he confesses his love for her and tells her to stop struggling. In a final attempt, Abby says the safe phrase, "I love you, Tim." This causes Tim's system to shut down completely, making him lose balance and fall with Abby. The movie concludes with Abby managing to hold on to the wall, ultimately saving her life from the horrifying robot. And with that, the movie ends. If you've enjoyed this recap, feel free to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode.